Here is a read aloud of the Jungle Excerpt from your Jungle Excerpt and questions. Directions. Read the following and then answer the questions. One of the most famous examples of a market economy is a book written by Upton Sinclair called The Jungle. He wrote this book in 1906 to expose the working conditions of a meat packing company in Chicago. The following reading is a paraphrased version of one of Sinclair's passages from The Jungle. It begins by describing an inspection of slaughtered pigs. Before the pig's body was accepted, it had to be inspected by someone. The inspector would feel the pig's glands to make sure it didn't have tuberculosis, a deadly lung disease. The inspector was not being overworked, and he didn't seem to have a fear of working with dead animals. He was quite talkative and would engage in conversation when prompted. During these conversations, he would explain the dangers of ptomaines, which were poisons that developed in decaying meat and vegetables. The only problem with his conversational personality was that the talk would distract him from inspecting, and many pigs went by him uninspected. Working conditions for the meat packers. There were many men who worked in the pickling rooms. These rooms were full of dangerous objects and chemicals. It was hard to find a man who worked in the pickling room without some sort of sore on his body or a missing finger that had been burned off by acid. Then there were the butchers and the men who regularly used knives. Of these, it was hard to find a man who had a whole thumb. Time and time again, the base of their thumbs had been slashed until they were just mere lumps of flesh. The hands of these men would be crisscrossed with cuts until you could no longer pretend to count or trace them. They would have no nails. They had worn them off pulling hides. Their knuckles were swollen so that their fingers spread out like a fan. There were men who worked in the cooking rooms in the midst of steam and sickening odors by artificial light. In these rooms, tuberculosis could live for 2 years, but instead was resupplied every hour. There were the beef luggers, the men who carried 200-pound quarters to the refrigerator cars. This work was also dangerous and began at 4 o'clock in the morning, wearing out even the most powerful of men. There were those who worked in the chilling rooms and whose special disease was rheumatism, a disease that causes inflamed, swollen joints. The time limit that a man was said to survive the chilling rooms was 5 years. There were the wool pluckers, whose hands went to pieces even sooner than the pickling men. This happened because in order to pick the wool off of a sheep's hide, the workers would first have to apply an acid to loosen the wool, and then use their bare hands to pick the wool, the acid burning their fingers the entire time. There were those who made the tins for the canned meat, and their hands too were a maze of cuts, and each cut represented a chance for blood poisoning. Some worked at the stamping machines, and it was very seldom that one could work there at the pace that was set without chopping a piece of his hand off. There were the hoisters, as they were called, whose task it was to press the lever which lifted the dead cattle off the floor. The filth and greed. The meat would be shoveled into carts. The men who were shoveling the meat did not even remove a rat if they saw one. There were things worse than poison rats that ended up in the sausage anyway. There was no place for the men to wash their hands before dinner, and so they washed their hands in the water used to rinse off the sausage. There were many odds and ends and pieces of meat that would be dumped into a barrel to be stored in the cellar. Every spring, these barrels were cleaned out. They were filled with the scraps of meat, dirt, rust, and nails. Cartload after cartload of these contents were sent up to be mixed in with the fresh meat. That would later be served to the public for breakfast. In complete sentences, answer the following questions. Number 1, what surprised you the most when reading this passage? Number 2, What are some changes you would make to this company? Number 3, what were the conditions like for the workers? Describe at least 2. Number 4, this represents a pure market economy. One positive of a pure market economy is that producers and consumers have so much freedom without laws from the government. Using this reading as an example, explain what is negative about a pure market economy. Support your answer with an example from the reading.